Here in London, on the banks of the River Thames, is a most incongruous sight. Lashed by centuries of rain and ever pining for the elusive British sun, which has joined us today, is a 3,500-year-old ancient Egyptian obelisk. While we call it Cleopatra's Needle, it actually has nothing to do with Egypt's final queen. While Cleopatra reigned through the downfall of ancient Egypt, the man who commissioned this, Pharaoh Thutmose III, brought ancient Egypt to the absolute pinnacle, the zenith of its power. So who was Thutmose III? Why was he arguably the greatest of all Egyptian pharaohs? And what does the placement of an ancient Egyptian obelisk in the city of London have to show us about the nature of power itself? This is The Liberator, and today we're going to be exploring one of the Bronze Age's most formidable rulers, Thutmose III. Now, to appreciate the scale of Thutmose III's achievements, we must first set the scene. It is the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. The pyramids are already over 1,000 years old, and Jesus of Nazareth is still 1,500 years in the future. Egypt, after a period of political fragmentation and foreign overlordship, has reasserted its independence. It is about to have its claws sharpened by a string of incredible rulers. Who am I referring to? Well, the first of these, the founder of ancient Egypt's legendary 18th dynasty, is none other than Thutmose I, the grandfather of Thutmose III. He really sets the scene for ancient Egyptian imperialism. His armies penetrated deep into the heart of Africa, destroying the kingdom of Kush and its capital at Kerma. The Kushites had been strong enemies of the Egyptians in the past, something that Thutmose I simply could not abide. Accompanying him on this brutal expedition was his young and no doubt impressionable daughter, Hatshepsut. And Thutmose I did not stop at Kush. He then campaigned in the Levant, the lands of Canaan which had produced the Hyksos, a people who had conquered and occupied parts of Egypt about a century earlier. While Thutmose asserted himself in this region, his presence was not permanent. He erected a stele at the Euphrates River, but the lands behind him were not truly incorporated into a new regime. When he died, his son Thutmose II took over, but his reign was only 3 years long. He left the crown in the hands of none other than Hatshepsut, a remarkable female pharaoh ruling in a man's world. While Hatshepsut surely demands her own episode, she was initially supposed to be holding the crown on behalf of the young boy Thutmose III. However, as her reign progressed, she began styling herself as a full pharaoh and ruling as Thutmose III's co-ruler. Her extensive building programs in the lands of Egypt reshaped the country in her own image. Now, it's impossible to know how much Thutmose III learned from Hatshepsut, his highly capable aunt, stepmother, and co-ruler, but we have to imagine that he learned a few tricks from her. By the time Hatshepsut died and Thutmose III became sole ruler, Egypt was in a strong position to continue Thutmose I's imperial legacy. Now, Thutmose III has been described as Egypt's Napoleon, and for good reason. Not only did he win the 17 or so military campaigns he led throughout his reign, but he also left us a sense of his tactical mind and strategic brilliance. So how do we know about the greatness of Thutmose III? One extraordinary source into the character of Thutmose III is his account of the Battle of Megiddo, written in the inner sanctum of the god Amun at Karnak Temple. It is the first detailed account of a battle we have from anywhere in the world. Military history itself begins with Thutmose III. Megiddo, the biblical Armageddon, is today located in northern Israel. Since the time of Thutmose I, the lands of Canaan had begun shrugging off any sense of Egyptian overlordship. Traditionally a patchwork of independent city-states ruled by kings and chiefs, much of Canaan had been coming into the orbit of a new, powerful state based in northwestern Mesopotamia, the kingdom of Mitanni. The Mitanni were an Indo-Aryan people, master charioteers with fascinating connections to distant India. So early in Thutmose's reign, the king of Kadesh rallied a coalition of Canaanite city-states to rebel against Egyptian authority. In the shadows, the kingdom of Mitanni was likely pulling strings. This rebellion came in the very first year of Thutmose III's sole reign. However, the young pharaoh would not disappoint. The conflict between Canaan and Egypt was personal. The scribes at Karnak record how Thutmose III left Egypt's borders filled with memories of when Canaanite chiefs, the Hyksos, had picked at a fragmented Egypt like vultures. Now for a long period of years they had ruled in this land which was plundered, every man enslaved before those chiefs who were in avarice. So revenge was on its way in the guise of Thutmose III and his army, and what would his army have actually looked like? Well, we can imagine thousands of lightly armed infantry, many with no armour beyond simple tunics or leather helmets, wielding ox-hide shields, spears, and battle axes. Archers would have formed a crucial part of the force. Some would have been drawn from Nubia, who were renowned for their deadly accuracy. But this was the age of the chariot. Elite warriors fought from fast two-wheeled horse-drawn platforms. There, armed with powerful composite bows, they could rain arrows down at their enemies from a distance, skewering their foes with terrifying precision. Yet as Thutmose's forces approached the city of Megiddo, he was confronted with a difficult choice. Several different paths led to the city. There was a northern path and a southern path. Both were obvious, uncomplicated, but exposed routes. There was, however, an unpopular third option. An extremely narrow mountain passage where men and horse would have to proceed one by one. Thutmose allegedly insisted on taking the difficult path. Then His Majesty commanded that the whole army be addressed thus: "Your victorious lord will guard your steps on that path which narrows." Then His Majesty made an oath, saying, "I will not let my victorious army go in front of my Majesty in this situation." For His Majesty had resolved to proceed himself at the head of his army. Then every man was given his marching orders, horse following horse, with His Majesty at the head of his army. When the Egyptians came out of the pass, they found their approach unopposed. The Canaanites had not expected the Egyptians to take such a hazardous road. Now imagine the tension as the Egyptians set up their camp and prepared for battle. Sentries running back and forth. Thutmose trying to inspire the men. "Prepare yourselves, sharpen your weapons, for battle is about to be joined with that cowardly enemy at daybreak. Be steadfast, be steadfast, be vigilant, be vigilant." And as the morning sun rose, what did the Egyptian soldiers see? The appearance of the king at daybreak. His Majesty set out in a chariot of electrum, equipped in the splendour of his weaponry, like a strong-armed Horus, lord of action, like Montu the Theban, his father Amun strengthening his arms. Electrum is a gold and silver alloy, so just imagine what that chariot would have looked like, glinting in the sun, dazzling the eyes of everyone who looked upon it. When the Egyptian force came thundering at the Canaanites, they were taken by surprise and completely routed. Thutmose allegedly led the Egyptian army right from the front. Essentially, the Canaanites took one look at the Egyptian army and said, "Armageddon out of here." But the fortress of Megiddo was not taken immediately because of a lack of discipline among the Egyptians. The Egyptian troops started looting the enemy chariots and the dead, and failed to press home their advantage, a detail which Thutmose III has recorded somewhat saltily, I'd say. However, after a protracted siege which lasted for several months, the Egyptians were victorious. Now the chiefs of this foreign land came on their bellies to kiss the ground before the might of His Majesty, to beg breath for their nostrils on account of the greatness of his sword arm and the extent of Amun's power over every foreign land. So the Battle of Megiddo, the first detailed battle narrative in human history, really sets the tone for Thutmose III's reign. An endless stream of military glory and victory. 11 years after victory at Megiddo, with all of the ports and riches of Canaan under his belt, Thutmose III decided to launch his most ambitious campaign yet, which would take him right into the heart of the kingdom of Mitanni. So Thutmose had an entire fleet of ships dragged over land by ox cart from Syria to the Euphrates River. This was the border of the land which had birthed all of the world's most ancient civilizations, Mesopotamia. As Thutmose's chariots flattened the grasses of Mitanni and the air roared with songs and hymns to Amun, the kingdom was caught completely off guard. Hundreds of Mitanni were captured, including 30 of the king of Mitanni's wives. Next to his beloved grandfather Thutmose I's stele, on the banks of the river Euphrates, Thutmose III erected his own. And Just take a guess what he did next. Like, if there was any doubt about his machismo, he then proceeded to hunt the elephants which lived in northern Syria at the time, in the land of Nai. He supposedly killed 120 elephants in this hunt. We can only imagine what that sight would have been like. Chariots crashing through the bracken, men launching arrows and spears into these huge, frightened animals who could at any moment turn and gore man in chariot in a huge eruption of blood and splinters. Thutmose's final campaign down in the lands of Kush cemented the Egyptian Empire's existence for another 300 years. Gifts came flooding in from Babylon, from the Hittites in Anatolia, even from the distant kingdoms of the Aegean Sea. Egypt's prestige and its power had never been greater. But while Thutmose III's credentials as a warrior are indisputable, he was also a very shrewd statesman. While Canaanites, Nubians, and Kushites had always been reviled as Egypt's natural enemies, their increasing presence within the Egyptian state required compromise. So princes and chiefs from these lands which Thutmose had expended so much energy annexing were to be welcomed into the Egyptian establishment. Kushite lords were given places at court, Syrian princelings trained in the Egyptian classics and customs, and many richly dressed Asian wives filled up Thutmose's harem. The hostages Thutmose snatched from conquered peoples were trained and educated in Egypt, and then were returned home, thoroughly Egyptianized. Indeed, Thutmose's construction of a temple to the god Amun at Jebel Barkal, deep in Kush near the Fourth Nile Cataract, would become a future nucleus for Kushite culture and identity. By the time the Kushites had their own empire and ruled as pharaohs in the 25th dynasty, they were not just acolytes of the god Amun, but zealots. But all of this has been quite glowing. Can we really trust these accounts? Can we really drink Thutmose's own Kool-Aid? It's all his propaganda, after all. There are, in fact, hints of a more disturbed, or at least a more human character beneath all the glitz and the glamour. How, after all, we must ask, did Thutmose feel during those long years of co-rule with his aunt, Hatshepsut? Indeed, is it possible that in such a patriarchal world, Thutmose III may have resented the power of the woman who stood between him and the throne? There is, in fact, some evidence which potentially suggests as much. 25 years into Thutmose's sole reign, he began a campaign of defacement against Hatshepsut's monuments. Her name, her image, her very memory was systematically destroyed by agents of the king, wiped from her statues and buildings. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this. It could be that Thutmose wanted to make sure that his son, the future Amenhotep II, had as good a chance as possible of succeeding him peacefully. Removing the memory of Hatshepsut and delegitimizing her could potentially dissuade her relatives from trying to stage a coup and take the throne after Thutmose died. However, it's also possible that enough grandees and senior officials from the reign of Hatshepsut were still in post when Thutmose took over. Perhaps he did not feel strong enough to move against his stepmother's legacy until these people had left office, and he had a free hand to act. Whatever the conclusion, the potential Freudian undertones of having this beef with your stepmother was too interesting to go unmentioned. Amusingly as well, Thutmose III may not have been a looker. His mummy was discovered in a cache of numerous other bodies in 1881. These mummies had essentially been stowed away in the Ramesside period to hide them from grave robbers. However, the grave robbers found them all the same, and the considerable riches of Thutmose's coffin and body had been stripped from him. But when Gaston Maspero unveiled the face of the conqueror in 1886, who has an intelligent and somewhat feminine look in his portraits, he was somewhat disappointed. Its appearance does not answer to our ideal of the conqueror. His statues, though not representing him as a type of manly beauty, yet give him refined, intelligent features. But a comparison with the mummy shows that the artists have idealized their model. The forehead is abnormally low, the eyes deeply sunk, the jaw heavy, the lips thick, and the cheekbones extremely prominent. Now, I don't point out the peculiarities of Thutmose III simply to belittle him or mock him. He was obviously an inspired, energetic, and deeply skilled leader. He must have had a towering personality. But it's important, and no doubt much easier with hindsight, not to swallow myths hook, line, and sinker. He was a human being after all, even when the propaganda makes it much harder to see his flaws. Indeed, the myth of Thutmose III, the aroma of the great pharaoh, has proved irresistible to future generations of empire builders. Rameses II, another great pharaoh, made his own inscription here on Thutmose's obelisk, trying to co-opt the monument for himself. 1500 years after it was built, the Romans brought this obelisk from its original standing place at Heliopolis to Alexandria. There it decorated a temple of Julius Caesar, standing, no doubt, as a symbol of Roman virility, its presence mystifying and mythologizing the deceased dictator. Another of Thutmose's obelisks, the largest standing Egyptian obelisk in the world in fact, was transported to Rome in the 4th century. Another went to Constantinople. There they remain. How many generations of conquerors, from Romans to Charlemagne, from Crusaders to Ottoman Turks, would have looked upon these ancient symbols of power and identified with them? Cleopatra's Needle here in London also has a sister obelisk with the same name, which stands in New York City's Central Park. Yet more imperial metropolises decorated with monuments from an ancient conqueror. But when you inspect the gaudy Victorian sphinxes which flank Cleopatra's Needle in London, you'll notice shrapnel holes. They come from a German bomb dropped in 1917. If it had dropped any closer to the obelisk, it would have shattered it. Yet, still, there it survives, a phallic testament to the cult of greatness. Thutmose III was great, and the great live and die by the rules of conquest, by the laws of the jungle. But jungle cats get old, and the mantle always passes. Let us hope that when it next passes, it will be done with a handshake and a smile, because the game of greatness so often ends with the thundering of chariots or a hailstorm of bullets. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you like and subscribe the video if you haven't already. See you next time for more wonderful stories from the Bronze Age.